All right, we've been talking about the Industrial Revolution, and we've been talking about how it started in England. Now we want to talk about how it spread. Um, there were laws put in place by the English to try to limit that spread. The goal was basically to maintain their advantage in industrialization. So they basically wrote anti-emigration laws, meaning if you had special knowledge of how the factories worked or machinery, you were not allowed to leave. Um, you were not allowed to take that knowledge to another country. But eventually, the spread started to happen. It happens kind of organically with Belgium, France, and Germany. There's enough interaction between those countries and people movement that eventually people just, gained the knowledge, whether that was by visiting England or from people in England moving back to the continent or whatever it might be. So what you do see is Northern and Western Europe starting to become industrial in the early 1800s. You might say late 1700s. That's a possible time frame too in some cases, but basically that means Belgium, France, and Germany. Now the Netherlands will eventually get that too, but they stay a little bit more agrarian. That's farming based, a little longer. And actually, really interestingly, Southern and Eastern Europe stay agrarian and agricultural for a long time, another 100 years, 150 years. It's not until World War II that Italy starts to try to make the transition to becoming an industrial nation, and Greece was really agricultural until after World War II. And actually, you might say that it's never become particularly industrial. It's become a more urban society, but not necessarily industrial in the same way as we might think of some other nations. But I want to focus in on the story of the United States a little bit. One of the first people to show up in that story is Samuel Slater. Basically, Samuel Slater was an Englishman who saw an advertisement in a newspaper, and basically the advertisement said anybody who wants to risk breaking the law, these anti-immigration laws, and would come to the United States to help set up a factory and bring your expertise to bear on the cotton industry in New England, then they'll be paid very, very well. So Samuel Slater answers that call, and he's actually going to come over to Rhode Island, and that's where the first factory will be in the United States. And I mean, there's other places that you can see sort of industrial roots taking place, but most of the time Samuel Slater is given the lion's share of the credit, and it goes into the New England area, which has really a lot of the same attributes as England: the swift flowing rivers, the dense population. Um, it was ripe for becoming industrial in several ways, and one of them is it didn't have very good farmland. New England is very, very rocky soil, so um, anything more than sustenance farming is pretty difficult to pull off. Eventually, people do turn towards like dairy farming and things like that in New England, but um, those states, those former colonies and then states, were not really able to produce food on any large scale. So it turns out to be a really good scenario for them to become industrial, at least as far as industry jobs go. A person who expands on that is a man named Eli Whitney. Now, Eli Whitney is a pretty famous personality, and I bet you've heard of him. He was actually a lawyer who was educated at Yale, but took his first job down in Georgia. And when he got to Georgia, he saw a lot of poverty there. And so he basically asked, like, what's needed? What could we do to fix the poverty? And people said, well, one of the biggest reasons there's poverty is it's really difficult to refine cotton. We can grow a lot of cotton and we can pick it, although that's labor intensive, but refining it, we just can't do it fast enough to make a good profit. So he created what was called the cotton gin. I'm sure you've heard of it. Basically, it purifies cotton, gets all the seeds and everything out of it, and makes it ready to use. And it does it much, much faster. The old method was basically just people sitting there with piles of cotton in their laps, pulling the seeds out. And so he created this cotton gin. that made cotton growing much more profitable in the South. Now, there's a really terrible side effect of that. There are some economists and historians who say that slavery was about to die an economic death in the South, that it was just not viable economically to try to own a lot of slaves and plantation work and growing cash crops and cotton. It just wasn't making enough money. But the cotton gin changes that, makes it so that they can make a lot of money. And so some people say that Eli Whitney sort of rescues slavery. And I'm sure he didn't mean it in that particular way. But some people say, he causes the Civil War in the sense that if it wasn't for him, slavery would have died out. Now, if you do say that he causes the Civil War, I guess you'd also have to say that he helps the North to win the Civil War. Because another one of his industrial ideas was called interchangeable parts. So the most famous example of how this worked and how he applied the idea of interchangeable parts was to the construction of rifles, the production of rifles. So what I want you to imagine is basically that in the cottage industry days, before industrialization, they would essentially make one gun at a time. They'd make a barrel, and they'd make the stock, and they'd make the trigger, and all those parts were meant to fit that gun. And so if you took a piece away from that gun, or let's say a piece of it failed, you'd have to construct a brand new one to fit because it had to be unique to that gun. But what Eli Whitney said was, well, what if instead we just mass-produced barrels and mass-produced triggers and mass-produced stocks and all those things, and then we could just assemble them later. So instead of one gun at a time, they assemble 1,000 guns at a time. And so weapons and industrialization were a real strength of the North during the Civil War. And so you could say that if Eli Whitney did cause the Civil War, he also helped to win it. Another personality I'd like you to know about when it comes to the Industrial Revolution in North America, and especially in the United States, is a man named Robert Fulton. And what he's famous for and gets credit for doing is applying the steam engine, the technology of the steam engine to steam boats. He actually created the Clermont, who made the initial voyage up the river, the Hudson River, from New York City to Albany. And basically, this is how it went. Before that, to go upriver was very, very difficult work. Basically, you would stick a pole in the ground, in the water, and then you would push the boat upstream. It's a little bit more efficient than just that, but I can't really demonstrate on video like this. But basically, it's called poling, and they would kind of stick the pole in the ground in the mud of the river, and they would walk in such a way as to push the boat up the river like a treadmill underneath them. And once they got to the end of the boat, they would pick up the pole, go to the front, stick it in the mud again, and then walk backwards to push the boat up the river. And that was really, really arduous, and it took forever. And it was like 1 mile per hour. It was like as fast as they could go. Well, the Clermont was able to go 9 miles per hour up the Hudson River, and that made a huge difference. And pretty soon there were entire fleets of these steamboats, going up and down the Ohio River and the Mississippi River and the Missouri River and the Hudson River. And it made it possible to ship things much more efficiently. We talked about how the prices actually come down because shipping prices went down. That makes food more available and so forth. What ends up happening then is people could sell their goods really across the country now. A farmer in Ohio could sell their corn to people in Philadelphia, partly because of Robert Fulton and partly because of the expansion of the railroad. That made it possible to ship things so much more efficiently around the country. And what that meant was less farmers could produce more. They didn't need as many farmers anymore. with the new tools that were coming in, with tractors and plows and so forth, one guy could do the work of 10 people from before. So that meant there didn't need to be as many farmers. So what ends up happening is people start moving to the cities. That's where the jobs were. Urbanization. There are some fascinating statistics about how quickly the cities were growing in North America and in in Europe as well, with how cities were going from being below 100,000 people to being over 1 million people. And in the United States, the first city to make it to 1 million was New York City, and then the second city was Chicago. It kind of gives you a sense for how the expansion of the network of trains and steamboats makes it possible for cities to grow quickly, because Chicago is much further west than several other major cities like Boston and Baltimore and Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. But being on the Great Lakes and being a train hub made industrialization possible, or I should say urbanization possible. And so the culture is fundamentally shifting. And that's what I want to talk about tomorrow, is the shift of the culture, like new classes of people developing, how this impacts the family, how this impacts women. That'll be something that we talk about tomorrow. I'm going to be posting the worksheet for the week. I don't think it'll be very difficult. I'll kind of give you a heads up of where we are in the textbook, but basically we are working our way more or less through section 1 of chapter 19. So page 612 is where that starts. And I'm giving information that the textbook doesn't, so you're going to need to listen to these videos to be able to do the worksheet. But it should be pretty straightforward, and it'll be due Friday. In the meantime, I'm going to go celebrate my son's birthday. My son Cash will turn 10 today, so we're going to make him feel special today. I hope you are doing well. We love you. We miss you. You're almost done. Keep it up.